and welcome to the Pragmatic Product Chat series, where we tackle the biggest challenges facing today's product management, product marketing, and other market and data-driven professionals with some of the best minds in the industry. I'm Rebecca Calageris for Pragmatic Institute and your host for this episode. Today, we're going to talk about one of those sort of maybe underappreciated, understood skills that makes product managers great and actually makes for really great leaders. And that is the ability to, facilitation, right? How do you run a meeting? How do you get other people to participate? How do you get customers to there's a whole art and science to this that for most of us, we know it when we see it, but we don't necessarily know the magic that goes behind it. But that is not true for our guest. Our guest, Douglas Ferguson, he is an entrepreneur, human-centered technologist with over 26 years of experience. He is the president of Voltage Control, which is a facilitation academy that teaches leaders through certifications and workshops and events all about facilitation. He has worked with leaders and innovators in Nike and Google and Air Force and Gap and Tesla and Adobe and just all the big names that make you really excited and jealous. And prior to that, he spent a lot of time in sort of the Austin startup world as a CTO in numerous positions. So he has been in the technology company from a leadership perspective and now really brings his experience to others to help them kind of master the skills necessary for strong leadership. So welcome, Doug.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes. All right, Douglas, tell us about your origin story. What got you where you are today? Why are you so passionate about facilitation and helping people develop this?
Yeah, I was interested in technology from a young age, taking things apart, putting them back together, and started writing software on a Commodore 64 of all things.
Nice.
And so quickly learned how to debug and how to think about what kind of experience I was wanting to create long before I even knew those words. Before UX was the hot topic, right? And fast forward to post college, I was writing a lot of software and got really good at that, and then got catapulted into leadership. And like many folks, and I'm sure there's some listeners right now in the same situation. Maybe you just got promoted, or you're reflecting back to when maybe you were managing teams, or maybe you just had someone get promoted above you and you're like, gosh, I don't know if they know how to lead. Well, that was me, right? I was really good at writing software. So they thought, let's put the person that's really good at this stuff in charge of all the people doing that stuff without any training on how to be a good leader. And I quickly realized that, as an individual contributor, your job is to have the answers or figure out the answers. And if you're doing that as a leader, it's exhausting because you're just constantly having to, it's just overwhelming, and no one else likes it, right?
Right. Yeah.
Everyone wants to have the room to grow and be that person that is really great. And so it's how do you enable the others around you? So I quickly learned that lesson and then started collecting lots of tools and techniques to become really good at that. And, I think that was something that I felt was quite different between me and my peers. A lot of my CTO pals were obsessed with the technology. And I tended to be a little bit more of a VP of engineering / chief product officer / CTO. It was a cocktail of all these interests. And so I was on this quest to create high functioning teams. And what tools were out there? Early on it was extreme programming, and then Agile and Scrum and all these things. And ultimately, just layers and layers of tools to help people collaborate better. And that became an obsession to the point where after my last startup, I thought, what if I just did that full time? And so I started Voltage Control.
I love that. I think that is, it is a really true sort of leadership knowledge and understanding that a lot of us go through, right? You're going to get promoted to a leader. You're really excited. You're concerned you're going to fail, and you think you have to have all the answers, right? You're going to fail because you don't have all the answers. That's not why you're going to fail, and it's not going to why you're going to succeed, right? It really is about the team you create and enable. And to your point, there isn't always a lot of, that's not really a course that most of us have in college, right? It's not a skill that a lot of us are taught to do. It's some people do it more naturally or others, but like it is really about how do you enable your team? How do you make sure you're getting all of the good ideas and good inputs from all of the people, including the quiet ones in the back?
Absolutely. And I think I was going to just say a lot of leadership programs focus on executive presence and presentation skills and these kinds of things. And sure, storytelling is really important, but I think there's just a real lack of focus on collaboration and how we bring people together in a way that, elevates the intelligence that's nascent on the team.
Mm-hmm. When you think about some of those sort of core tenets or the things that need to be in place or should be in place in order to enable that type of collaboration, what are some of those things that you talk about with the people you work with?
Well, it's certainly a cultural phenomenon around, there's lots of components that will naturally create an environment for this stuff to emerge. You hear a lot about psychological safety and, creating space and making it known that we value and care about these things. And, I think that's where real values come into play, because a lot of companies will, throw these words on the wall and say, here are our values, but what are we really living and how are we showing up? And if we say we really value our employees, then how are we, what sorts of experiences are we creating and how are we prioritizing that? So that's number one. You have to have this cultural foundation of an interest in this work, or else it's like, even if you're building the competencies, it's really hard for them to take root. So it's that leadership support and vision around making it possible. Not that grassroots efforts can't go anywhere, but I think the cultural stuff's super critical. And then if you layer in our 5 qualities of facilitation, which are the competencies that we base all our curriculum on, the 5 qualities are to be purpose, to be inclusive, to be clear, crafted, and adaptive. And certainly, I could certainly go into those, but those 5 elements go a long way when people are able to master those competencies and driving better decisions, better outcomes for our goals and projects. Oftentimes, it's the kind of thing where it might look like we're moving a little slower at first, but gosh, do we build a lot more momentum and durability around the work we're doing?
Well, let's touch a little bit on those, if that's all right. So you said,
yeah.
See if I got them all right. Purpose, inclusive, clear, crafted, adaptive.
That's exactly right.
All right. Let's just go down the list. So when you think about purpose, is this making sure everyone understands the purpose of why we are here? Or is there another?
You got that right. And it's even deeper than that, because oftentimes as the person calling the meeting, we're not even super clear on the purpose. As one of our heroes, Priya Parker, says, a category is not a purpose. So a sales kickoff is not a purpose. Why are we having that sales kickoff? A project kickoff is not a purpose. Why is it important that we're having this project kickoff? And how can we design with that purpose in mind? The problem with category and what might be a thinly veiled purpose is that often we'll get into rituals and habits, and we're not inspecting what we're doing closely enough to really lean into an appropriate design. And also the interesting thing about purpose is it leads into all the other qualities. All the other qualities scaffold into purpose. We can't be inclusive unless we're clear on our purpose. So you're right. People need to understand, and sometimes it's really important for us to gut check that purpose. So we got to be clear to our, we had to clarify it to ourselves, and then we had to clarify it to our participants, to the folks we're inviting. And then we also have to re-clarify it when we're starting the session. And it's really, really important. I think a lot of people just assume that, hey, we all know why we're doing this. And then that can lead to, the number one reason people get disgruntled by meetings is because they thought we were going to make a decision. It didn't happen, or they thought there was some outcome that was going to happen. And maybe the person calling the meeting was just gathering information so they could go make the decision. And that's the classic, well, why did they ask for my opinion if they weren't going to use it?
Right.
Well, they wanted it, they weren't clear on the fact that, hey, I'm going to collect this information, then I'm going to make the decision. And so if we can clarify those purpose, those intent, it can really alleviate a lot of pain and discomfort.
Give me an example of like a good purpose, like a meeting, like somebody sent you this purpose. You're like, yes, I'm so excited for this meeting.
Yeah. Well, here's some ways to think about it. We talk about meetings being informative, explorative, decisive, and sometimes there's team health meetings. And oftentimes I'll ask folks if they're having trouble letting go of a meeting, because you hear that classic, this meeting could have been an email.
Yep.
But when you talk about not having it, people get really defensive and say, "Oh, we have to have the all hands meeting." And I was like, "Well, why do you have to have the all hands meeting?" And it's like, "Well, I want to have a moment to connect with folks and to see everyone." I'm traveling a lot. I don't get to connect with everyone in the trenches so much, and I want to hear their challenges. I want to surface up some of these insights. And then I'm like, okay, well, why are you presenting the whole time? And then leaving 5 minutes for questions at the end. That sounds like an informative meeting to me. That sounds like something that could have been a Loom video. Maybe it feels reassuring that you're just seeing a bunch of faces on the screen, so you feel connected to them. But I can guarantee you, they're just getting bombarded with a bunch of information. It's not necessarily an effective way to do that. And so we have a weekly meeting that the whole purpose is we call it weekly connection. And we call it that because the main point, sure, we're gonna get clear and aligned on things that, like, if there's something we were wanting to get across the finish line, but there's a few little things to tie up, then we're gonna look at it all together and go, okay, are we good? All thumbs up. Are we good to go? Anyone object? Do we need anything we need to address before this goes live, kind of thing? In a way, it's kind of like in the software Scrum world, it's like a demo and there's bits of retro in there. But the real main purpose is to serve for a point of connection, because we are all remote. And so how are we honoring the fact that we want to stay connected and we want to build these relationships? And so there's a good part of the meeting dedicated to some storytelling and just checking in with folks. And so it's not, sure, we want to roll up our sleeves and get to work, but we also want to make sure we're honoring that purpose of connection, as well as some of the other outcomes we want to drive to.
So it's like the topic, but also the setting the stage for what kind of experience, what kind of output, what kind of pieces, and making sure that's aligned to the goal. To your point, if I'm trying to stay connected, it's not let me talk at you, right?
Yes.
And I think that's really smart, to your point, in thinking about it up front when I'm trying to do, because as you said, that clearly should inform how you design the session.
Exactly. And that gets into the crafted piece. And if we're not clear on our purpose, we might be more likely to throw so much stuff at the wall, versus if we get really crisp on our purpose, we know what we can shed and get rid of. And this even is helpful in strategy types of sessions, right? Because oftentimes getting clear on what something is not is helpful in understanding better what it should be and what it is. It's like the Moscow, right? Must have, could have, should have, won't have. Won't have is so important, right? Because then articulating that can really be illuminating to people. And so when we articulate our purpose, it helps us understand what it's not. So then we can jettison some things that aren't serving that purpose. They might be important things that we can come back to later, but let's not distract ourselves with that right now, because it's not critical to that purpose.
Nice. When you think about inclusive, I mean, that feels fairly self-explanatory, but I think probably there are some traps that we all fall into occasionally, where we include those we think will agree with us, or we include those who we find easiest to brainstorm with. Like, I am a big brainstormer. You could throw me in a room, not tell me what to expect, and be like, now let's talk about this. And I'm like, oh, this is fun. And I know plenty of people who worked for me where they're like, no, please don't do that to me. That's, it's really uncomfortable.
Yep.
So in my younger days, I might be like, oh, I'm going to play with these people because they play the same way I do. But when you think about inclusive, what are the sort of spots we want to make sure we're looking at for?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, this idea of, purpose anchors all the other qualities. So we can be a bit more appropriately inclusive if we are anchored in that purpose. And in fact, we can be a bit exclusive because people talk about exclusion being a bad thing. But if we're intentionally exclusive in a really healthy way, it can actually be really great for the culture because, we're all inundated with this hamster wheel of meetings. We're in meetings like back to back all day, 6 ways to Sunday. And one great way to eliminate that is to get really clear on our purpose and start using that as a compass for when we're thinking about who to invite. And to your point, we don't want to just invite those that are going to be most agreeable. Like, oh, let's
right, yeah.
And in fact, it's like we've had clients where we're doing a design sprint or some other kind of innovation workshop, and they're like, well, I don't know if we're going to invite Bob because he's such a curmudgeon. He's always shooting stuff down. And I'm like, does Bob have valid points? And it's like, well, yeah, but it just kind of ruins the energy. And I always tell them, let me as the facilitator handle the energy. We need Bob's critical thinking. And so that kind of gets back into the crafted piece a bit too. If we know if we're being truly inclusive, we're thinking about what triggers Bob. Why does he get into that mode of being extra critical and shutting things down? How can we craft an experience that avoids those moments, or maybe leans into them in a playful way, right? And it's not a bad thing. It's actually celebrating the fact that, hey, this critical thinking is an important part of the team. And so that's really what inclusion is about. It's not. We don't want to crop dust people's calendars with meeting invites. We want to be thoughtful and intentional and driven by our purpose as we're selecting folks. And, it's funny. I had a client where they talked about meeting FOMO. It's like if you weren't in the meeting, it was a sign that you're missing out or whatnot. Yeah. And so it created this really bad dynamic where everyone wanted to be everywhere, and it was bloating meetings. And I think that, if we're really clear about the purpose, then people can even opt out. We have a policy at Voltage Control where every meeting is optional. And so if you're not clear on the purpose, or it doesn't seem like something you're going to be able to provide value to, or it's not going to provide value to you, then don't show up. But, be courteous and kind to your facilitator and let them know ahead of time, hey, I'm going to tap out of this one because I don't think, because then that can be a great cultural moment where if you as a facilitator are hearing that, oh, Susan doesn't want to come because she doesn't think it's going to be of value, then it might shine a light on the fact that you haven't quite clarified the purpose. Because if you see how she's going to be able to provide value, but she doesn't, clearly, something was not communicated well. And so that can be a signal versus everyone just assuming, okay, we're just going to go, we got invited, we're going to show up and then complain about it later.
That's interesting because so often you hear like don't invite me to the meetings, but you're right. There is the other side. If we think of the meetings as a place where strategy and decisions happen, then you can definitely get a fear of missing out. So you talked a little bit about this, but I may have this situation currently with a curmudgeon, right? Who has 100% valid points. But in the meetings, when we're reviewing things, I am used to Bob. We're going to call him Bob. We're going to keep calling him Bob. Yeah, so I'm like, Bob's important. It's okay. It's fine. But I can see the emotions get triggered in other people who feel that it's shutting down the thinking, right? In their mind, coming in with the nitpicks, the whatever shuts down everyone's creativity. Tell me more about how to help not manage Bob, but how do we make a situation that I get all of the inputs of Bob and everyone else in the room is also comfortable?
Yeah, there's lots of strategies, and sometimes it's idiosyncratic of which Bob we're talking about. sometimes it can be as simple as, Bob kind of rains on the parade a little bit, and then as a facilitator, we say, "Hey, that's an interesting point. So we need to keep that in mind. What else are people feeling, thinking? What else do we need to consider? Anyone have any counterpoint? Anyone disagree with this? It's so, and it's difficult as a stakeholder, when you're facilitating and you have to play that role of stakeholder. And I think the more you can compartmentalize your roles and in the moments, right? If you step in and think to yourself, I'm embodying this role of facilitator right now. Because as a product manager, product owner, all these different titles, that might be the identity you think of when you're showing up for work. But if you're running a meeting and you need to manage dynamics of the group, really thinking about stepping into, imagining the meeting being a temporary world you're stepping into, and you might bring on this facilitator identity in that moment. And maybe you leave some of your product management, some of your product owner, whatever title, whatever identity you have, can help maybe divorce you from your opinions. Because I think that's where people really struggle, is when Bob's really bringing them down. And then the rest of the group then is reciprocating those emotions, right? Or mirroring them, because they're like, yeah, I agree. This is a bummer. But if you have a real neutral, if you can see anything as a benefit and flip it around and really be that coach for the team and for the outcomes, and be divorced of because it's easy, I think, when we're like, hey, I'm the product manager and I really got to get some solid requirements out of this meeting, or we really got to get this grooming done, or whatever it is that we're doing. And then someone's derailing the conversation. It can really feel like it's at odds with this thing you're trying to accomplish. Whereas if you kind of divorce yourself from that and think, I'm facilitating, my job is to make sure this group works well together and has a positive outcome. And how can I make sure everyone feels comfortable? And so I think it's acknowledging Bob's response, redirecting, inviting others in, and realizing that it might be nitpicky and annoying, but we'll move. It'll be fine. We'll move through it, kind of thing. Also, and this is where the nuance gets and where lots of practice and experimentation comes in. But even trying out different activities and different modes, right? If you're doing something that like work alone together is a concept that comes up a lot in facilitation. So asking people to quietly, and this is really helpful also, not only to stifle someone who might be overly negative and just spewing out like all this nitpicky stuff and it's just overwhelming, because when it's volumetric, it can be really hard to do the redirect. If it's just a few things here and there and people are just focusing on it too much, you can redirect that attention. You can add some levity and appreciate it. Add some appreciation for it. It doesn't have to be, even though it's got a negative context. Yep. It's like, hey, thanks, we appreciate it. But when it's voluminous, it can be a little hard to manage. And so the way you can address that is with this kind of work alone together stuff, or other types of tools that might limit the amount of dialogue, but still allow us to work in parallel. So if you're in a in-person meeting, you might have people write on sticky notes quietly. If you are in a virtual setting, you might be in Miro or Mural, and then everyone's simultaneously putting stuff down. So all my software nerds will like this. I call it the multi-threaded meeting. So rather than going around and everyone speaking their turn and then someone over speaking and dragging and maybe just sending people off on a spiral of negativity, everyone's just in parallel putting their stuff down. And then once everyone exhausts their stuff, then you can even ask them to prioritize. Okay, based on these things, what 1 to N things do you want to surface up to the group that are most important? This also helps too, because a lot of times when people enter the room, they're coming from some other place. Some of this verbal diarrhea is a way of processing and prioritizing and sifting and sorting, because they're doing it out loud with the. Yep. So if they're doing that quietly in front of themselves, it's sort of like the reason that Amazon has the one pager that they make people write, and then everyone reads at the beginning of the meeting. I call it the boot up time. And so there's many ways to design that in, but making sure you have some time for people to reflect, think, collect, and sift and sort, so they're not just bombarding the team with all this stuff, and it's selective and we're bubbling up the things that are most important. And those kinds of moves and designing in mechanisms can make things run a little bit more smoothly and avoid some of that unnecessary conflict. And then we can invite some healthy conflict where we're really disagreeing, but it's on stuff that's high priority and stuff that really matters.
There's some really good like tactics and really good like strategic advice there, right? Even just like, for some of like getting it out, right? Putting it on the post-it note means it's out of my head, and then making us pause and prioritize all of the items, right? So we don't feel like we got to get through a whole list, but I think is really, really smart. Another thing that you kind of talked a little bit about when you put on like the two different roles, I think one of the traps that people fall into, it's kind of like it go either way. Either you're trying to show that you're a product manager who's in control, so you're facilitating, but you're not letting go of they're not sure leadership mantle is the right word, but like the need to be in charge and right? So I definitely see that where someone's holding too close to the control. And then I see the reverse sometimes, which I think is, it's kind of the same thing, but where there is someone in a much higher leadership position who's running the facilitation, and maybe the team doesn't trust it yet, that they really mean it, right? And when you're like, I do really mean it. So like, let's talk a little bit about both of those. Let's start with our product manager who's just wants to show they're in control, like feels like if they don't, it shows weakness, right? Like they've shown the belly and they're all over because everyone will smell their blood or whatever.
Yeah. I think that it's just something that takes practice, and you have to build comfort with, letting go of that need to have some skin in the game on the decision.
Yeah.
And also, if you are going to be juggling, it's good to just say that out loud too. Like we often talk about whispering out loud. So what are the quiet things that we might be thinking to ourselves that maybe I'll just share this with the group? Like, hey, I'm in this facilitation role now. I'm also the product manager in charge of this feature, and so a lot of this rests on my shoulders, and I'm accountable for this. And I ultimately had to make some decisions, but I really want y'all to be involved here. And so I'm kind of juggling these two different modes, and I'm going to do my best in this moment to be a facilitator and support you through these conversations. And so just work with me on it, because the more that once you have that conversation and say that, it really breaks down some defenses. And then other people might assist you too. They might realize like, oh, I see them shifting more into like telling us, or like pushing toward showing bias toward a preference. And then maybe someone else on the team can step up and say, hey, what did Susan had another opinion on this. Let's hear from her a little bit more before we go too deep into that,
Mm-hmm.
And so
they can help. Yeah.
Yeah. And I talk a lot in the book Magical Meetings about this. There's a whole chapter on being a magical meeting participant. And so once you build facilitation skills, you can show up to meetings in a totally different way. And it's not about usurping power and taking over someone's meeting, but it's sort of like being a basketball player and doing a little assist. So because the person that puts that ball in the right spot is just as important of a player as the person who dunks the ball. Right. And so how can we assist in those moments? And so if you're in a situation, you can even premeditate it and talk to a few folks and say, hey, like, let's support each other in our facilitation journey. You can help me out in these moments because I have to juggle being the facilitator and being the owner of this feature or this project or this kickoff. But also I do think saying it out loud and letting people, just vocalizing these things so that the team understands where we're at. And now going to the leader one and building trust, I think that's one of those things that as a leader, you had to have a lot of self-awareness. I think also as a meeting participant, if you're in a meeting with a leader where you're noticing other people are holding back out of some of that fear, I think even just naming it or just modeling how everyone should show up, because once it's sort of like a domino effect, right? Like once or in the elevator, when everyone's looking one direction and the next person gets in, everyone follows those behavioral things. And so if one participant starts really leaning into cues and participating, it's infectious. And so if you're noticing a leader struggling in that way because folks like don't quite trust it yet, you can help like assist in those ways. And then the leader just has to reinforce that they're serious about it. And then, I think silence, I've been talking a lot, which is funny that I'm going to talk about silence, but silence is such a powerful facilitation tool because if you're not getting the engagement you want, I think a common reaction for folks is to jump in and fill the silence because it feels awkward. But one way to get engagement is just to wait for it.
It's such a good point. I think so many people are afraid of the silence, that they fill it too soon. Even when you feel like you paused, it's never like enough. It's really hard. Yes.
Especially in multicultural situations, I always tell people to count to 10. It's a nice way to have something to think about while you're waiting.
You've mentioned a couple of times the importance of practicing facilitation. And it's like, that makes complete sense to me. I'm thinking about how to practice facilitation when it's not like the highest stakes, like maybe not do it the first time in an executive meeting. And I know you guys do labs, which I'd love to hear more about too. But what are some ways to practice? How should we start to build that muscle?
Yeah. I think to your point, I think the operative word is high stakes, right? So how can we find the low stakes moments? And so it's going to vary by context and by individual. Sometimes there's opportunities within the team to try out some of these things. Sometimes it may be subtle, right? When you show up for an executive meeting, you might be pulling out all the stops. But how can you try a little thing in this meeting and a little thing in that meeting? Because it'd be overwhelming to treat like a 30-minute meeting like a one-day workshop, right? But you can try out little companies, little tools. For instance, thinking about purpose and inclusion and these things, you can start to embed that in lots of places. If you're doing any volunteer work, say you're on a board or there's some group you're helping out, or there's community, or whether that's your church or some group that you support, they all have meetings of some sort. And so volunteering to support there can be great opportunities to have low stakes opportunities. Yeah.
That's a great place too, because I've found when working with sort of nonprofits and on boards, it is sort of the classic need for a facilitation as well, because there isn't necessarily the same hierarchy and the same sort of standard operating procedure execution rules that you have in a lot of organizations. And so it is sometimes harder to move the group towards a spot or for them to see it. So I could see that being very helpful for them, and also, to your point, a good place to practice. And it's interesting too to practice facilitating on areas that are less where you don't have an opinion necessarily, right?
Yes.
Right?
Because then you can start to get familiar with how that feels.
Yes. And because I think even when you think you don't have an opinion about something, you have an opinion about, right? It'd be interesting to facilitate, to switch and facilitate with a peers meeting, and they do yours, and just see. That is an interesting idea to me, because it would really help me divorce opinions, which is always the goal, but not always the success.
Yeah. And that's something we work with teams a lot with our corporate programs, because usually, our certification program's a public cohort that, individuals come and join. But when we're working with companies, we're doing stuff that's a bit more custom, and, we're adapting the curriculum to their needs. And one of the things we do is a community of practice. And so folks are coming and sharing stories about where they found opportunities to practice, where they applied things in little subtle ways, or ways they adapted tools to suit their context. And then in those moments in the community of practice, when they're sharing, we're also trying to cross-pollinate. Are there ways that they can support each other and, I love it when folks can come and facilitate for each other. Unfortunately, a lot of companies are in a situation where everyone's
Yeah.
so slammed. It's like, how do I even add another meeting to my calendar? But when it's possible, wow, is it super cool? Because it's like having a outside facilitator, but without having to go through procurement and all that nonsense.
NDAs right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, a little bit of contextual knowledge, which can be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. It's totally helpful, especially, because when outside facilitators come in, one of the things they do is get I would say really great facilitators. What they do is they get a really good perspective on the people. So that inclusion piece, if they're going to assist in that decision, they need to know the pieces on the chessboard. Like, what are the personalities? What are the challenges? What are the interests? What are the motivators? And then they can assist in that. And then also in the session, they're more likely to be able to draw the best out of everybody.
Yeah. Well, we talk a little bit about craft, right? And so understanding who's going to be there and the purpose of it helps you craft the right experience for the right meeting. And one of the things that I think is interesting is like, when I'm doing this, like there are I'm such a game person. I love games. I can make almost anything a game. And so I lean a lot into, can I make it a game? Right? Because like, that's just who I am. But I love the idea of also a community that has other approaches, right? Like there are so many ways and approaches and tools that you can use. And sometimes just having a catalog of it, having someone who's like, oh, in this situation, this kind of exercise or setup can be really helpful, I think would be incredibly valuable. And my team would probably appreciate it if we didn't always play a game.
Yeah, well, having a grab bag in your own toolkit is like really powerful. And that does come up from time to time in organizations we work with. Specifically, I can think about Microsoft. This team was doing a lot of design thinking, but they were using it in the context of employee onboarding. And so they really needed to rethink how the tools function because they were driving to a slightly different purpose. They needed to adapt some of the language because, instead of customer persona, it's an employee persona. Some of these things were subtle, but some of them were more fundamental and a little more, and even profound at times, where they were thinking about designing some real important differences into those tools, and then they organized them into a framework that folks could use and draw from. So then it was like not just something that you could go on the internet and read about and pick some random tool. It's like, oh, here's kind of our way of thinking about this and approaching it, and then it became something they could teach to and even like have metrics around.
Ooh, interesting. It's interesting when you think about magical meetings and when you think about facilitation, and the goal of that is to have better, more productive meetings, right? To get the results you're looking for. Are there measurements that you use to quantify your success in this space?
Yeah. Well, a lot of it's qualitative, but you can still create it. A lot of people are popular. Excuse me. A lot of people are fans of the Net Promoter Score, but you can certainly, EOS has a meeting they call the level 10 meeting.
Yep.
And at the end of the meeting, you're supposed to have everyone rate it from 1 to 10. And, the goal is that it's well designed and there's a good flow so that you should regularly get 10s out of this meeting. And so it's similar to the bathroom, like rating when you leave. It's like the sad face, the neutral face, the happy face. I
just cleaned my hand.
Yeah, I know.
I'm not touching this.
Why would you touch that thing? Yeah, they need a mind reader,
right?
or maybe there's like a foot switch,
a foot pedal, right? That would be like, yes. Let me tell you, yeah.
Yes. Hey, this is how companies get started.
Yes, we're gonna make bathroom scoring foot pedals. Thanks for listening. We're done.
Yeah. I think having some rating system can be powerful. Of course, people will get a bit fatigued if you're asking them to do that all the time. You can also look at, if you're really clear on your purpose and what you're driving to, I think those are things you can measure as well. So for instance, like if the purpose of the meeting is to get like clear on like our timeline, and we notice, and then we go back and we look and we say, wow, we're like 80% more likely to like be on target on our timelines than we were, or other kind of throughput metrics. But the thing is like with anything, if you're changing too many things at the same time, is can you really attribute it back? Also, the thing I'll say, so you've got sentiment of how people are leaving the meetings, you got the outcomes and how effective or efficient those outcomes are seeing. Are you noticing changes there? And then also, I would say, are you able to drive the same results with less people in meetings? Because then there's a direct cost of the business there, because you're not, people in meetings, you're paying for them to be there.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. All right, we talked about a bunch of different things, and I could talk to you for a lot longer. But if you were going to have listeners do 2 things differently tomorrow, based on what we talked about today, what would it be?
Great question. I think first and foremost, try out the work alone together. Give people time to pull their thoughts together, like put their stuff down, prioritize the contributions, and then as a group review them. And for extra credit, if you're getting anywhere 7 and above, think about having people talk in pairs. If you're using Zoom or Google Meets or Teams, they all have breakouts. And so you can just split people into groups of 2 or 3, have them talk, and then come back. You're allowing that sifting and sorting to happen more organically. And you can even do that in a room, but I know a lot of people are doing a lot of their daily meetings in the virtual space. So I think about that work alone together kind of technique. And then I'd also, to your point, find some opportunities to practice in low stakes moments so you can start to get a feeling for what it's like to just be a facilitator. So in those moments where you have to do both, you can have a better feeling and sense of what it's like to move between those 2 modes and honor them separately.
Nice. All right. If people wanted to learn more about you and what you guys do and how to be a better facilitator, where should we send them?
Yeah. So I think there's 3 places. If you want to learn about me, lots of stuff on LinkedIn. I'm very active there. And if you want to learn about voltage control, our website is great, voltagecontrol.com. If you want to look at any events we have coming up or check out our certification program. If you want to dive in and start practicing facilitation skills in a supportive community and group of peers and explorers of all things facilitation, check out Facilitation Lab at facilitationlab.com.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, Douglas, for coming on. This was super interesting. I think there's so many good tidbits that will help our listeners. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
All right, everybody. Thanks, everyone, for listening. And don't forget to join us next week when we tackle another great topic designed to help you elevate your product, your company, and your career.